Hi, this is the voice of Heidie Calero with another economic capsule. This time we have entitled the topic is the China Challenge. The first graph that I'm depicting for you shows from 2000 through 2030, even though it doesn't say so, but it is the forecast of the population of China, which is the red bars, compared with the US. China has 1.4 billion people. That's a lot of mouths to feed. Compared with the US, it's about 365 million people. And even through the forecast, that big gap will still remain. So in this challenge of what is the trades, what are the ties in trades in terms of investments, what are these two global economies, the US, which is already the number one, and China, which is the number two, aspiring to be number one. What are the ramifications for the global economy in terms of these sanctions that the US is trying to impose? But first of all, let me just remind you of the reshaping of this global economy with these three graphs of pies that I'm showing for you. The first one is 2000 as a percentage of global gross domestic product in real terms. US was 30% of that global GDP in 2000. China was only 4%. By 2023, US had gone down 26%, but China had increased to 18%. And by 2028, it is forecasted that China will contribute 21% to the global gross domestic product, and the US will still remain with 24%. But notice that this giant, this Asia giant, is increasing at enormous strides. And nothing more than illustrating this with this third graph, which is the China's real growth, which is the red line that you see there from 2000 through 2022, the last year that we have available. And from 2000 through 2016, notice that China was growing at the clip of 8 to 10% annual growth after COVID. And right now, it's somewhere in the region of 2 to 3%. So enormous challenge, especially if you tie that with the 1.4 billion mouths that must be fed, and all the sanctions that the US is imposing, as well as its allies in terms of the export of technologies, the export or the imports of chips. It's many things that are happening in terms of trying to curtail the impact of China. Notice that the growth of the US has been hovering between 4%, 2%, and even now it's at 3%, similar to China's. And Puerto Rico's, of course, is the green line. It's anemic growth, it's negative growth. Let's look at that catching up of China in terms of its gross domestic product as a percentage of US GDP. And notice the graph from 48%, which it was in 2011, by 2020, it was 76%. It's now down to 71%. You know how much that is, the difference in that gap? It's about $8.9 trillion that the US economy is higher, is bigger than the Chinese economy. But China is making strides, definitely. President Trump imposed a lot of sanctions in this war against China, and President Biden has not eliminated them. On the contrary, it has imposed more export controls in technology. It has put more controls and sanctions in terms of the imports of from China, and also the technology that can be exported to China, and even sanctions on US investment in Chinese companies in the frontier of China. So China is not going to stay quiet. They have also imposed restrictions on US companies as well as European companies that are following the example of the US. So in all of this, there is real war going on, and Puerto Rico is not exempt from all these influences and forces that are occurring now at a global level. The next graph that I'm depicting for you is the influence of China. Notice this is the USChina Trade Gap. Those are, the blue line is the exports, US exports to China, and the red line is the imports from China. Notice that gap that has been widening. More imports from China, lower exports to China from the United States, and that is what is called a trade deficit, which of course is closely tied also to the strength of the dollar. But definitely this widening of this gap is partly the strength of the Chinese economy, and even Europe cannot decouple that easily as well, because it is also dependent on China. And then not only is in trade, but notice in terms of investments, this final graph that I'm depicting for you is China's increasing influence in Latin America and the Caribbean. In 2000, more or less, the mustard color was the influence or the investment, a foreign direct investment of Chinese in Latin America and the Caribbean. That was about $300 billion, about 300 million. Notice by 2020, it has been $12 billion, and that U.S. investment, also Chinese companies investing in the U.S., it's about $37.5 billion. No, decoupling is not going to be that easy, and certainly it's going to cause a lot in terms of the ramifications going forward, unless we find a stance and a middle ground between these two economies that also are carrying Europe, are carrying Asia, are carrying Latin America and the Caribbean. And Puerto Rico should not be just focusing in its growth dependent on federal funds. That is not the solution. Puerto Rico has to be producing more, maybe chips, pharmaceuticals, which are imported from China to the US. Certainly Puerto Rico has to be at that big table of discussion instead of just focusing on more federal funds. If you liked our economic capsule, don't forget to go to YouTube. Give us, subscribe to the Voice of Heidie Calero. Give us a like in those economic capsules. Remember, this is a service of Puerto Rico Economic Pulse, and that the economy is all of us. Thank you.